Twit has the shrinks. As soon as Mrs. Twit sat down, Mr. Twit pointed at her and shouted, "There you are! You're sitting in your old chair and you've shrunk so much, your feet aren't even touching the ground." Mrs. Twit looked down at her feet, and by golly, the man was right. Her feet were not touching the ground. Mr. Twit, you see, had been just as clever with her chair as he'd been with the walking stick. Every night when she'd gone to bed, he'd snuck downstairs and stuck a little bit extra onto the chair, as he'd done with the walking stick. "Just look at you sitting there in your same old chair," he cried, "and you've shrunk so much your feet are dangling in the air." Mrs. Twit went white with fear. "You've got the shrinks," cried Mr. Twit, pointing his finger at her like a pistol. "You've got them badly. You've got the most terrible case of the shrinks I've ever seen." Mrs. Twit became so frightened she began to dribble. But Mr. Twit, well, he was still remembering the worms in his spaghetti, and he didn't feel sorry for her at all. "I suppose you know what happens when you get the shrinks," he said. "What?" gasped Mrs. Twit. "What happens?" "Your head shrinks into your body. Then your neck shrinks into your body too. Then your body shrinks into your legs, and your legs shrink into your feet. And in the end, there is nothing left of you except a pair of shoes and a bundle of old clothes." "I can't bear it," cried Mrs. Twit. "It's a terrible disease," Mr. Twit said. "The worst in the world." "How long have I got?" cried Mrs. Twit. "How long before I end up as a bundle of old clothes and a pair of shoes?" Mr. Twit put on a very solemn face. "At the rate you're going, I'd say not more than 10 or 11 days. "But is there anything I can do?" cried Mrs. Twit. "There's only one cure for the shrinks," he said. "Tell me," she cried. "Oh, tell me quickly." "We'll have to hurry," said Mr. Twit. "I'm ready. I'll hurry. I'll do anything you say," cried Mrs. Twit. "You won't last long if you don't," said Mr. Twit, giving her another grisly grin. "What is it I must do?" cried Mrs. Twit, clutching her cheeks. "You've got to be stretched," said Mr. Twit. Mrs. Twit gets a stretching. Mr. Twit led Mrs. Twit outdoors, where he had everything ready for the great stretching. He had 100 balloons and lots of string, and he had a gas cylinder for filling the balloons. He fixed an old iron ring into the ground. "Stand here," he said, pointing at the iron ring. Then he tied Mrs. Twit's ankles to the iron ring. When that was done, he began filling the balloons with gas. Each balloon was on a long string, and when it was filled with gas, it pulled on the string, and up and up and up they went. Mr. Twit tied the ends of the strings to the top half of Mrs. Twit's body. Then he tied some round her neck, some under her arms, some round her wrists, and even some to her hair. Soon there were 50 coloured balloons floating in the air above Mrs. Twit's head. "Can you feel them stretching you?" asked Mr. Twit. I can, cried Mrs. Twit. "They're stretching me like mad." Then he put on another 10 balloons. The upward pull became very strong. Mrs. Twit was quite helpless now, with her feet tied to the ground and her arms pulled upwards by the balloons, and she was unable to move. She was a prisoner, and Mr. Twit had intended to go away and leave her like that for a couple of days and nights to teach her a lesson. In fact, he was just about to leave when Mrs. Twit opened her big mouth and said something silly. "Are you sure my feet are tied properly to the ground?" she gasped. "If those strings around my ankles break, it'll be goodbye for me." And that's what gave Mr. Twit his second nasty idea.